5 years later since the rise of Skywalker.
5 years? It's a long time.
Between then and now, with all the stuff that's happened in my personal life and around the world, honestly, it feels like several lifetimes ago. There was a few times where I found it kind of difficult to talk about the prequels the way I did, mostly because of the newfound consensus and the newfound love and appreciation that they've received over the last few years. But since I made my consensus known about each film and that trilogy, I thought it'd be fair to balance it out to a certain degree with the sequels, The Rise of Skywalker. We've had a fair amount of time to process The Rise of Skywalker, and I don't really see that many people warming up to it. I've seen a few people giving their positive thoughts on it. And at the time in 2019, there were some positive reviews that I found of it. Mind you, they were very few and far between. I was fairly positive when I first saw it, especially in comparison to The Last Jedi. But of course, with the fan response, it really just soured my mood on Star Wars altogether. Even after I watched it once when I bought it on Blu-ray a few months after, I practically distanced myself from the entire franchise. Looking back on all of it, even the most diehard fanatics of Star Wars, and even the most diehard haters of the sequels or the prequels, can all admit that this hasn't exactly been an easy ride. But with the prequels, and even all the way through the sequel trilogy and all the other films that came out in between, it was real, it was fun, but I would say extremely chaotic and obnoxious. Generally speaking, people were positive on The Force Awakens, even though a lot of its detractors called it a rehash of A New Hope, which is not the case. But people were still willing to see what the sequel trilogy had to offer. And then Rian Johnson came along with The Last Jedi, and all the creative decisions that were made, well, most of them anyway, didn't really sit well with most fans. Some were pleased and they liked the bold direction that it took, but for others, and myself included, it left a lot to be desired. And with J.J. Abrams coming back to The Rise of Skywalker, there was some hope on my end anyway. I can't really speak for anybody else. Maybe there was some of that in the fandom, that maybe he could put Star Wars back on track. He did it once before with Force Awakens, and then he was coming back to do it again. He's clearly passionate about the source material. Read, listen, or watch any reviews that he's done throughout his career, and you'd have to be a moron to suggest otherwise. But while the lead up to it was fairly exciting, there was some apprehension on certain choices that were being made. From the very first trailer, right before we see the title, we hear a familiar cackling laugh.
No one's ever really gone.
Yeah, it was pretty clear what their intentions were from the get-go. Myself, and for many other people, if I'm assuming correctly, I know they say never assume anything, I think the fans were willing to give JJ and the creative team the benefit of the doubt, because there could have been all different ways that Palpatine could have showed up. Maybe it was like a red herring, or maybe that there was some kind of a vision. But as each trailer came out and we got closer to the release date, it looked like he was actually still alive somehow. Even me, I was starting to go, okay, how is that possible? And of course the questions came in with Rey. Was she really a nobody? Or is there something else to it that we don't know about? And the fan reception was extremely negative. Last time I checked, it's 51% positive on the tomato meter. Before we start talking about the movie, I want to get a few things out of the way for you guys. First of all, if you don't know what happens in here, after 5 years, you've had plenty of time to give it a watch. Not going to cover absolutely everything, but we are going to cover a lot of details, so spoiler warning if you don't want to know what happens. And as far as my overall verdict, I'm going to try to be as realistic and as grounded as possible. And I know some of you guys either feel lukewarm about Rise of Skywalker and some of you actually hate it. All I ask is that you be calm and just hear me out. To be honest, I haven't watched the movie in 5 years since I picked it up on Blu-ray. During the first few weeks of COVID, when everything closed down, it was some kind of sense of comfort that I was able to find amidst all the craziness that was happening in the world at the time. But I wanted to try to refresh my memory and see how it compares to everything else 5 years later, because now we've had the Mandalorian series, which is clearly building towards the sequel era. Anyone who tells you there's going to be a retcon of the sequels, don't believe any of that. To be real with you guys, my overall thoughts on the movie are kind of complicated. Similar to how I feel about Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3. I can watch it and have a good time with it, and it has some truly great moments, and I think those moments that I'm going to mention are some of the best that the saga has had to offer. But realistically speaking, it's okay. An average film at best, if anything. I certainly understand why people don't like it, but I also understand why people do like it in comparison to Last Jedi. After the huge, bold swings that its predecessor took, this was a complete 180 turn in the opposite direction. Full-on fan service, probably the biggest one with Palpatine's return, which we are going to talk about later. And I don't want to sound like a complete broken record as I mention this. I am going to mention this a few times, but the biggest problem with the movie for me is the pacing. It makes the whole thing feel very, very rushed. There are some times where it does slow down and it gives us some really nice character moments. And while I find myself fairly invested in the creative decisions that are made, and I think that there is a good movie in here somewhere, it just feels very cramped. And I think an extra 45 or 50 minutes would have really allowed some time for the whole thing to breathe and flesh out certain things that we need to know more about. But the film takes place about a year after the events of The Last Jedi. The Resistance is still trying to figure out a new plan to combat the First Order, and they receive a message from the unknown regions of Exegol. The opening crawl makes it abundantly clear in the first sentence: "The dead speak. Emperor Palpatine is back." Good to know that subtle isn't in this movie's vocabulary. The planet that we see in the opening scene actually is on the planet Mustafar. The last time we saw that in the saga is when Anakin got burnt by the lava river and Palpatine came to save him. And seeing how the planet is starting to heal itself, I do kind of like that being a reflection of what Anakin went through all that time ago. But then he finds the Sith Wayfinder, which gives him a path towards the planet Exegol, making his way into the secret lair where Palpatine is being kept on life support by his loyalists. The whole set of his secret lair is actually very well realized and extremely creepy. Not just the music, but the sound effects, along with Palpatine talking to Kylo, showing him his plan to use the Final Order as a secret plan that he's been constructing for many, many years, offering him a place as the Supreme Leader in the new Final Order, telling him to kill Rey, but also telling him to beware that she's not who he believes she is.
Who is she?
Seeing the Emperor smile like that at the time, I thought, yeah, okay, I think I know who she's related to. But I tried to think that, oh, maybe it was just a fake out, but yeah, you get the picture. The next couple of sequences that we get are Poe and Finn going on a mission to get a message from a spy in the First Order. It's a small moment, but I really like the interaction that Poe and Finn have with Chewie as they're playing the board game.
How did you do it?
This guy right here, it's because he cheats.
I'm kidding.
Oh, come on, take your
You're
turn.
250
You're
years
taking
old.
forever.
Of course
250 years old? You look great! So then they get the message from this alien. I can't remember the alien's name, but he's voiced by Mark Hamill. Knowing that knowledge and hearing his voice, it sounds exactly like his Joker voice. And the chase sequence that ensues is really, really fun, even though it happens a little too quick for my liking. And that goes for a lot of the other stuff that's in this film. But seeing Poe pilot the Falcon with Chewie's help, and Finn fighting off the TIE fighters through that quad cannon. Nice little progression on how we saw them stealing a TIE fighter from the First Order, and now here they are in Rise of Skywalker with a lot more skill and experience. And the light speed skipping I thought was a really neat detail as well. Back when I first saw this, when the Falcon goes into hyperspace,
We're safe. Okay, we're not safe.
I guess after 30 years or so, they would figure out a way to update their technology. This light speed skipping, I think, adds a different kind of tension because whenever they stop doing it, they end up in these random areas and you're not exactly sure what area they're going to end up in next, putting some much needed obstacles between them and the TIE fighters. I'm surprised Han never managed to figure that out. That is, if it was a possibility during his prime. But the next sequence we get is Rey continuing her Jedi training under Leia. I will say this. Seeing Rey become a lot more reserved and more mature by this point in the trilogy was a really welcome addition. She starts out in The Force Awakens as very naive, impressionable, and very excitable. Then in The Last Jedi, when she meets her hero, seeing how he actually is, it crushes her spirit a tad, and she becomes jaded and more stoic as a result. And at this point in the timeline, as I said, she's much more reserved, but still has moments where she lashes out. She has a long way to go with her Jedi training, but she's clearly on her way to becoming a skilled warrior. Seeing Leia training her as a Jedi Master, I think we all know that she was a Force-sensitive person, and it's revealed that she had some Jedi training in the past under Luke. But as far as the use of Leia in this film, they used some unused footage from The Force Awakens that didn't make the final cut, and they reworked it into The Rise of Skywalker. I think that this was a very classy thing on the filmmaker's part. Most of the film has J.J. Abrams basically with his hands tied. This situation, I think this is probably the best way he could have gone about it, and even the most diehard haters of The Rise of Skywalker can admit this. I really wish the training scene could have gone on longer, but what we do see I really like when she goes up against that remote droid that Luke was going up against from training with Obi-Wan on the Falcon, and Kylo puts his hand on Darth Vader's burnt up mask and is able to connect with Rey through the Force once again, and we see these flashes and these echoes of what they've said to each other, including Luke and Han from the past, continuing to remind us of the connection that they have with each other, and also showing us that Kylo Ren is still broken up over what he did to his father. Never ceases to send shivers all over my body. But when Finn and Poe arrive back with the message, they meet up with the First Order and they all learn that Palpatine has come back.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I gotta clear this up about that line. I've never had a problem with that, because of course Poe's gonna say it like that. The Resistance doesn't know how Palpatine returned. The problem is the movie doesn't explain how he returned. The closest that we get is this one character played by that actor from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I know he was one of the Hobbits. I can't remember which character it was.
Dark science. Cloning. Secrets only the Sith knew.
I mean, it's not like they have a direct line to the planet Exegol, so of course they're not going to know what happened. I mean, they have a long history of what happened with the Empire with their clone troopers, and the Sith are notorious for doing all these different things in order to stay relevant throughout the galaxy. Odds are they probably have some kind of methods to keep this going. So yeah, I think it's perfectly understandable why Poe would say it like that. I mean, ultimately it's the reason I think that, the movie doesn't really explain it, but I will take this line over the I hate sand line any day of the week. Yeah, I probably just upset some of you guys, but I could care less. And seeing the interactions between Rey, Finn, and Poe, I really like seeing that, but unfortunately, it's too little too late by this point in the trilogy. This is something that I think we should have saw more of in The Last Jedi. Probably going to be saying that a lot, and I'm bound to sound like a broken record at some point. Yeah, the whole lack of planning, we'll talk about that later, but this is unfortunately one of the many symptoms of the lack of planning that this trilogy suffers from. It feels very reminiscent of what we saw with Luke, Han, and Leia in the originals, and even little bits of Anakin and Obi-Wan in the prequels. But the way it's played out in here feels like it's two movies melded into one. In fact, if I'm being honest, I guess we're gonna have to get the they should have had a plan aspect out of the way. It's pretty noticeable that this film, or this trilogy, definitely needed a roadmap of some kind anyway. Because The Force Awakens, I think, was a really great setup. But then Rian Johnson came in with The Last Jedi and said, no, I don't want to deal with that. I'm going to tell my own story. I don't mean any disrespect to Rian Johnson, but he basically came in and made another setup, an alternative first act. So watching Force Awakens and Last Jedi back to back, it feels like the whole first act is extended into two parts. And now we have Rise of Skywalker that's trying to figure out how to conclude all of it. It literally feels like the second act and third act all fused together into one. Now yes, I know, a plan would have definitely made this trilogy better. Would it have softened the blow of the backlash? I don't know for sure. Maybe not nearly as much we would have heard about it, but still, having a roadmap really helps. For anyone who says that the prequels are better just because they had one consistent vision from beginning to end, yes, Chris Stuckman, I'm talking to you. That doesn't make the prequels good for that reason alone. To quote Goldman, one trilogy lacking something does not make the other good. But it's also like praising the Amazing Spider-Man films for saying that they're better because Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man has more of a sense of humor, that he uses web shooters, whereas Tobey Maguire never did any of those things. That's the bare minimum of what makes a good trilogy or a movie in the first place. Also, keep in mind, the original trilogy wasn't meticulously thought out and well crafted either. Luke was originally not supposed to be related to Darth Vader. Luke's sister was supposed to be a completely different character. And also, Obi-Wan was supposed to be the one who killed Anakin Skywalker, and that's what the reveal was supposed to be from Darth Vader. Obviously, they had more of an idea of where they were going with the originals. But just remember, it wasn't meticulously well thought out and crafted either. And say what you want about the MCU, especially after post-Endgame, they still have an outline for where things are going. Kevin Feige knows where things are going, but he allows people to come on board and play in his sandbox as long as they keep it within the framework of what he wants them to do. Even now, going towards Doomsday and Secret Wars, he already has a plan to get things back on course. It's really easy to point fingers and blame somebody if you're frustrated at how something turns out. And by no means am I saying that Kathleen Kennedy is a bad producer, nor is she a bad person. But there's no doubt that she said to Rian Johnson, do whatever the hell you want to do with The Last Jedi. And I think that's unfortunately become the biggest mistake of her professional career. I mean, she has a long list of credits of all these films that she's produced with Steven Spielberg and with many other creators in the industry. As an executive, well, ever since The Last Jedi, there's just been so many things that have come out and certain things that have gone wrong. I mean, to go into all those details, it's going to take me forever. I'm really putting the blame on Kathleen Kennedy, and by no means, like I said, am I saying that she's a bad person. At the very least, she should have put her foot down with Rian, or sat him and J.J. Abrams and Colin Trevorrow, or whoever was going to be helming The Rise of Skywalker, and say, okay, this is where the story's going to go. Rey's going to be a Palpatine. Palpatine's going to show up in Rise of Skywalker. You three figure out how to make this weave together coherently as possible. And if there is any other doubt that there really was no plan for this, in the most political way possible, he said he did his thing, I'm doing my thing. I'm connecting to what I did with 7. I mean, watching this film, it's basically a direct sequel to Episode 7, just like Last Crusade was for Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Temple of Doom was mostly its own thing. This whole movie, in a lot of ways, feels like a giant course correction, and maybe some people have interpreted it this way as a giant middle finger to Rian Johnson. The biggest one, I think, is when Luke catches the lightsaber as a Force ghost, but again, we're gonna talk about that later. I don't envy J.J. Abrams for having the hard time for trying to pick up the mess in the way that he was doing. Should he have done all 3 movies? Yeah, I don't think it would have hurt, because Chris Nolan did all 3 of his Batman films, and it felt like there was at least some kind of consistency with all 3 of those movies. Regardless of how you felt about The Dark Knight Rises, you at least knew what you were getting with him. Mission Impossible, they have different directors most of the time, except for, as of late, with Christopher McQuarrie. There's pros and cons to both scenarios. I'm not saying either one is wrong. People have wondered, why does he always jump out at the last second before the sequel? I think he's better at setting certain things up than he is on doing a sequel. Now, if he had somebody properly coaching him on how to make a proper sequel, maybe it could have turned out better for him. I don't know. And also, to get another thing out of the way, do I think the Duel of the Fates idea by Colin Trevorrow would have been better than what we got from Rise of Skywalker? Overall, it does sound kind of intriguing, but if I'm being honest with you, I don't really think it would have made much of a difference. It continues the idea of Rey being a nobody. There's a lot of people who never really liked that idea, this guy included. Either way, fans would have still been pissed off about whatever direction that movie took. I mean, this trilogy, I was getting more and more frustrated with each film on how the fans responded. That by the time this film came out, I just went, screw you guys, I'm done with you. So now the only person I listen to in regards to Star Wars content is the Goldman. Okay, back to the movie. I really went on a long tangent just now. Rey goes on an adventure with Poe and Finn to go to Pisana to pick up the trail of Palpatine's loyalist Ochi, going through a festival which happens every 42 years. A nice little nod to the timeline of chronology between A New Hope and The Rise of Skywalker. But then she experiences yet another connection to Kylo Ren through the Force plane, just like we saw in The Last Jedi. And this aspect, I think, is really awesome to see. I know a lot of people will throw their hands up in the air in frustration saying, how come they didn't do this in the other films? This breaks the canon, or, Again, Star Wars fans are never gonna like anything that's new, but then years later they accept it, so what's the difference? But really, I do like how we haven't really explored all of the Force yet, and it does show that there's different ways of using the Force. I mean, if you're bothered by that, I can easily understand why that would get to you. I guarantee you, 20 years from now, nobody's going to care about any of those things. But Kylo Ren has his mask repaired and is now putting it back on, with the obvious cracks spread all over it, leading to some tension with the First Order officers, except for General Allegiant General Pride. I really wish that we saw more inner workings of the First Order, but I do like the scenes that we get here, and it feels very much like what we saw with the Empire in the original trilogy. As far as Kylo Ren's mask being put back on, this is yet another thing that people say that this was JJ correcting what Rian Johnson did. Yeah, in a way it was, but I don't really think so. I mean, with Kylo Ren's character journey throughout all 3 of these films, it's not as gradual as Rey's is, but he starts off wanting to live up to Darth Vader's image, fearing that he's never going to be able to live up to that, so he kills his father in order to push himself further into the darkness. Unfortunately, when Han touches his face before he falls, it doesn't work. Supreme Leader Snoke in The Last Jedi sees that, and he mocks him for it, refusing to train him the rest of the way. And with him being desperate for some kind of validation or connection with someone, he connects with Rey on a deep level. Now that she's pushed him away, all he has left is to go back to what he knows. So he has the mask repaired and puts it on to cover up his scars. Spiritually, metaphorically, you get the picture. Clearly, Ben Solo has not properly processed what happened to his father, and instead deflects to Rey on her own insecurities about her parents and her feeling out of place throughout the galaxy. And then they get help from Lando Calrissian. Seeing the return of Billy D. Williams is never a disappointment in the least bit. Hello, what have we here? And how you doing, Chewbacca? You still hanging out with this loser? Again, I really wish that we saw more of that backstory with him and Luke figuring out where the Wayfinder was, but I do kind of like knowing that he was still involved with everything that happened in between both trilogies. They make their way to Ochi's ship where they find it still sitting on this big cliff, then they get sucked into this cave through the sinking fields, where they find Ochi's remains and a snake that's hiding in the cave, which we all know what happened after Ochi landed in that cave. And they find this dagger, which has clearly done some bad things, as Rey is able to sense everything that it's done throughout its lifespan or whatever. I mean, it's not too far off from when she touched the lightsaber and was able to have these weird visions about everything that happened in the possession of it anyway. But 3PO reveals that he knows where the Wayfinder's location is, but his programming forbids him to translate the Sith language that is inscripted on the dagger. 103 Fazillion languages and you can't read that? I'll stop when you stop doing all that shady stuff you do. But then we see the cave snake, and Rey uses force healing abilities to help it, and it shows him the way out. Again, another force ability that people just are furious over, and I think it's because Rey uses it. But does anybody remember A New Hope when Obi-Wan saves Luke from the Tusken Raiders, and he puts his hand on Luke's forehead? Probably was something that was on record in the Jedi curriculum. And if Rey is reading the Jedi text that she found on Luke's island, odds are they probably had something like that somewhere in the texts. And did anybody remember Palpatine doing the same thing to Anakin on Mustafar when he found him all burnt up like that? But Rey uses force healing abilities on the snake and Kylo Ren, and she's still a Mary Sue.
Yeah, okay.
So Rey goes further out into the desert, realizing that Kylo's coming for her. Chewie goes off to get Rey's attention, but then gets caught by the Knights of Ren. And then what we get is a really awesome scene, as far as I'm concerned anyway, when Kylo's TIE fighter barrels towards Rey, and she's running away from it, trying to run away from it, and she jumps and cuts the wingspan. Yeah, I don't care if I'm gonna get hate for this.
Badass.
But then Finn calls out to Rey that Chewie was taken away on a ship. So she tries to use the Force to pull the ship back onto the ground. And Kylo comes in to stop her, and they have a tug-of-war through the Force. Then she shoots out Force lightning out of her hand and destroys the ship, supposedly killing Chewie. My initial reaction when I first saw this: I'm really happy that he didn't die, because Chewie is just so lovable and innocent. It's like killing a dog in a piece of fiction. Like, no. All the human beings can die, but do not, under any circumstances, do the same thing to a dog or a cat. I'm not a cat person. My mom says the exact same thing about a dog. All the humans can die, but not the dogs. Just don't play The Last of Us Part 2 if you feel that way. But I really like the sense of shock and fear and dread that settles in on Rey when she realizes what she just did. But again, like with everything else, I wanted to see more of that. And the trio have to figure out a way to get the translation of the location to the next Wayfinder. So they go to the planet Kijimi, or Kijimi? I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. Poe goes there reluctantly because there's some old grudges that people have against him from that planet. With the help of Zori Bliss, played by Kerry Russell, who used to be Poe's partner, and reveals that he was a spice runner. You were a spice runner? You were a stormtrooper? You ran spice? You were a scavenger? We could do this all night. And Babu Frick, like everybody else has said, really hilarious. And it's the same actress who voices Moaning Myrtle in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets and Goblet of Fire. Still kind of blows my mind sometimes when I realize that. And even though I really wish they would have had this dynamic play throughout the trilogy, seeing 3PO have a moment where he takes one last look at everybody there, I gotta admit, it does kind of get an emotional response out of me. I mean, we've seen 3PO throughout all 9 of these films. Well, 10, depending on if you count Rogue One: A Star Wars Story. Just a brief appearance. We do kind of feel the weight of knowing that he's never going to be able to remember everything that happened throughout his time in the Star Wars films. I mean, he did have his memory wiped in Revenge of the Sith, but you know, this is a character that we've been following since 1977. I mean, even with all the problems logistically with the storytelling, like I said, it does genuinely make me feel a little bit of emotion. But then Kylo's Star Destroyer shows up, and Rey realizes that Chewie's still alive, and they go up onto the ship to rescue him. But not before Rey learns the truth about her parents from Kylo Ren, that they were killed by Ochi, who was sent by Palpatine to look for Rey. And then when she goes up onto the ship, she learns the truth about who her parents are related to.
You're his granddaughter. You are a Palpatine.
I'll admit, I was a little bit shocked back when I saw this. Even though I kind of knew where it was going, I was still kind of put off by how they revealed it. This is something that they should have done in The Last Jedi. I know, shoulda. I think if this was in The Last Jedi, that would have left a much bigger impact, but, you know, we'll save that for a Last Jedi video in the future. Rey being a Palpatine doesn't really bother me because I'll be honest with you guys, I've never liked the idea of her being a nobody. I know a lot of people wanted her to be a nobody because not everybody has to come from some special bloodline in Star Wars, and yeah, I would agree with that on principle. But the problem is, The Force Awakens should have established that right from the get-go. If they introduced Rey in the first film as just a nobody, it would have been perfectly fine. Everybody would have said, okay, whatever. But because they put all this emphasis on her backstory being this mystery, naturally, we assumed that there was going to be something more to it than that. It's not so on the nose or anything like that, but the movie does make it pretty clear they were setting something up for Rey's backstory. And then Last Jedi comes in and basically says, no, she's actually a nobody, and you don't have to be related to anybody to be important. It's a good message, yes, but in hindsight, it makes me look back at The Force Awakens and go, well, then what was the point of all that? I mean, you make her backstory this big deal, and then you go, oh, actually, it's not a big deal. I mean, don't be surprised if some people are going to be upset with you over that. Ultimately, the problem with Rey's characterization comes from The Last Jedi, as with just about everything else in here. Rey being a Palpatine does explain a lot of her strong abilities with the Force, but it was something that they should have expanded on in The Last Jedi, because we don't really get to see the exact backstory as to how her father is related to Palpatine somehow. I've heard plenty of things throughout the years that he was a clone, or that he actually was the natural-born son of Palpatine. I mean, either way, she is directly related to Palpatine by blood, so I don't think there's really any dispute there. And also, the reveal I kind of like as an echo of what Luke experienced in Empire Strikes Back. When she's standing on the ledge of the hangar and we hear the wind effect blowing and the soft musical cue that John Williams is cueing up, if that is not an obvious callback to Luke on Cloud City when he hears "I am your father," then I don't know what else is. I mean, do I think that Rey being a Palpatine was planned from the beginning? Possibly. From what I read of an interview with Daisy Ridley, it was one of the ideas that they were floating around as they were developing the trilogy. Even at one point they were considering having her be related to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Either way would have been fine with me. But really, with her being a Palpatine, or if they were indeed making her a Kenobi of some kind, it would be her correcting what her ancestor didn't do. Think about it this way. Her grandfather, Emperor Palpatine, brings a Skywalker into the darkness, Anakin Skywalker. Whereas Rey, in the sequel trilogy, she does the exact opposite with Anakin's grandson, Ben Solo. She brings a Skywalker back to the light. Execution aside, I really love that idea. I wish that we saw more of Rey soaking in this information and how shocked and unsettled she feels about the idea that she's related to the most evil man in the universe. I mean, to think that someone was willing to sleep with Palpatine. He was a politician, so politicians tend to do a lot of, well, yeah, we're not going to get into any of that. And to further add to that with Rey learning this information, if she had learned that at the end of The Last Jedi and then decided to go along with Kylo Ren out of desperation, that would have been the kind of conflict that was set up at the end, and then you have resolution in the third film. This feels like conflict and resolution all in one movie. For JJ to do all that stuff in about 2 hours, again, if he had tacked on, or if somebody had allowed him to tack on an extra half hour, or maybe even 50 minutes, it would have given the audience at least some time to breathe and feel that conflict and resolution play out. And that's why a lot of people, when they criticize this film, saying it's so convoluted, it feels like 2 movies melded into one. That's what happens when you screw up in the second act of a trilogy. If anything, your frustrations should be towards The Last Jedi, not The Rise of Skywalker. Regardless of how you feel about the film's quality, to J.J. Abrams' credit, aesthetically, the film looks really good, and he knows how to keep things going and keep the audience engaged, putting proactive characters at the center of it all rather than just sitting around not really doing anything. Case in point with the prequel trilogy. He's also very passionate about the source material, which is a lot more than I could say for certain blockbuster filmmakers in the business right now. And again, with how I feel about Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, where there was some sort of sense of authorship from Sam Raimi in that film. I mean, there is some corporate stuff going on with the creative decisions of The Rise of Skywalker, but J.J. Abrams' style is still there, and it feels like he is trying to salvage whatever he can that was set up in The Force Awakens. But let's talk about Finn and Poe. Finn's storyline, just like with a lot of other characters throughout this trilogy, fell victim to what happened with him in The Last Jedi. There was some great setup with him on how he was a deserter from the First Order, and then he went back reluctantly to help Rey. Then he ends up with Rose Tico, who takes him on this weird adventure to the Canto Bight planet, and he kind of just dawdles around, and it was a big disservice to what they were doing with him in Force Awakens. But then when he goes up against Captain Phasma, it gets a whole lot better, and it looked like they were actually going to have him go out in a blaze of glory, and then Rose Tico comes in and saves him. So really, Finn is just kind of there. He's fun to have around, and he does have his moments, and I really like seeing the backstory and the further fleshing out of how he felt about the Force bringing him to Rey, and what made him decide to turn from the First Order in the first place when he meets Janna, who shares with him that she was also a deserter from the First Order. And his thoughts on the Force echo what Han said to him and Rey in The Force Awakens, that he wasn't sure about whether or not the Force was real, but after everything that he experienced, now he's convinced. But Finn's inclusion in here feels very similar to how Han was using Return of the Jedi. Harrison Ford wanted Han to die in The Empire Strikes Back, and George Lucas argued against that. And the argument was that they could have rallied around Han Solo's death in order to find that energy to go up against the Empire in Return of the Jedi. Finn's sacrifice in The Last Jedi could have been something worthwhile like that. There was even an idea that he was going to run into all different kinds of deserters from the First Order in the original Duel of the Fates script. And in this film, we only get a little bit of that, but maybe in the future, in another film or maybe even a streaming series that takes place after The Rise of Skywalker, they could explore that. I mean, John Boyega has not been shy about how he felt that Disney used him in the trilogy, but people's opinions do change, and he might be open to coming back once again. If I'm not mistaken, I think I heard him say that he's not ruling it out. I mean, if Daisy Ridley is willing to return again as Rey in a solo movie later down the line, I don't think it's too far off to assume that John Boyega or even Oscar Isaac will do the same thing. As for Poe, to call him the Han Solo of this trilogy is kind of an easy and shallow way to describe him. He's a fun and likable guy, but he's also capable of a lot of depth. We do get some of that throughout this film where he's reluctantly put into the leader position after Leia dies, but then he receives some words of encouragement from Zori Bliss and Lando that they win by making you feel like you're alone. And once you have each other, that's how you win. An arrogant hothead, yes, but he clearly has a heart of gold, and he knows how to rally people behind him. So they end up on the planet where 3PO reveals the location of the Wayfinder. Rey makes her way into the room and finds the Sith Wayfinder, but runs into Kylo Ren, and they have their last big lightsaber fight. The polar opposite of what Anakin and Obi-Wan had on the planet Mustafar. I really would have liked the fight to go on longer, just a little bit longer, but the choreography I also really like. It's very messy and chaotic, and a lot of people don't really like how it comes off here. They miss the choreographed fights from the prequel trilogy. Yeah, it is cool to see Jedi on their prime, but after a while it just comes off as kind of overkill, and I've explained it. I think I might have explained it, I don't really know, but this to me feels more realistic. It's not some big, flashy dance where you're just kind of going, oh, that's really cool, but do I really care about what's happening? And some people will probably say the same thing about this lightsaber fight, but I personally am fairly invested enough in what's happening here. But then Leia has to make one big decision in order to get through to her son. She reaches out to Ben through the Force, and then Leia passes out on the bed and dies. Right in front of poor R2-D2. Hearing R2's whimpers, oh God, I'm gonna get emotional thinking about that. That, if anything, that is a beautiful full circle moment. I mean, the first time we saw them together was when Leia was giving R2 the plans of the Death Star, and now here she is in her last-ditch effort to save the galaxy. R2 is still right by her side. But then the next scene we get is, I would say, the best scene in the entire film, when Ben sees a vision of his father. In The Force Awakens, we saw it from Kylo Ren's perspective, but now we see it from the perspective of Ben, what he wishes he would have said to his father in that moment. After everything he's done, his parents still loved him anyway. I gotta tell you, as someone who has father issues of my own, this scene cuts pretty deep. And not to get too personal, but I did have a moment like this some time ago when I was trying to process certain things. It took a while, but it really put me on the right path. But then Rey ends up on the planet Ahch-To, then Luke's Force Ghost shows up to catch the lightsaber as she throws it into the wreckage of the TIE Fighter.
A Jedi's weapon deserves more respect.
Obviously, that's a pretty big jab to Rian Johnson with Luke throwing the lightsaber over his shoulder, but it's also a completion of Luke's character journey in The Last Jedi. Now he knows better thanks to Rey, and that he was in the wrong for isolating himself on that planet. And he also reveals that he knew that Rey was a Palpatine. Now that he's reestablished his connection to the Force, he would obviously feel that confirmation. But if you remember back in The Last Jedi, when he asked her, "Who are you, Rey from Jakku?" or Rey from nowhere, whatever he says, he was cut off from the Force, yes, but I would imagine if he was looking for the Sith Wayfinder, he may or may not have heard some rumblings of Palpatine having a descendant of some kind. And seeing Rey, I would assume that he was probably starting to think, is she who I think she is? And then when he connected with Leia through the Force, right before we see him tell the truth about what happened to Kylo that night, then he probably learned that information right there. Because As it's revealed, Leia knew it too. I do kind of like seeing those ideas in hindsight, but as usual, a little clarification would have helped. Yet in spite of Rey's heritage, Luke reminds Rey, her spirit and her heart is what really counts. And that's what separates her from her grandfather. Just like when Dumbledore tells Harry in the Order of the Phoenix, it's not how you two are alike, it's how you're not alike. But then he lifts the X-Wing out of the water, through the Force, to give to Rey in order for her to take on Palpatine. Even as a Force ghost, seeing him do that, with the Yoda theme playing by John Williams, I don't care if it's recycled, that is so cathartic that it's not even funny. I mean, as for John Williams' music, it would behoove me to mention it at least once. More or less recycled, yes, but don't even try to argue with me that John Williams is a disappointment in this one. If there's anybody in Hollywood who hasn't let me down yet, it's that man alone. If anyone tries to argue otherwise with me,
You have lost.
but okay, we've held it off for long enough. You want to hear me talk about Palpatine's return. I'm alright with a lot of the callbacks and similarities in The Rise of Skywalker, but this is too far. I'm not against Palpatine coming back in some capacity. If he was going to be along the lines of Vigo in Ghostbusters 2, where he was attempting to come back through a portal, I might have been okay with that there, and maybe the fans would have been alright with it. Inevitably, I'm just able to shrug it off and move on. I do like it in the sense that it's Ian McDiarmid still lighting it up in front of the camera. Ian McDiarmid's a great team player, so you gotta give credit where it's due. And it's one thing to say that Rey being a Palpatine might have been planned from the get-go, but to say that Palpatine was the plan from the beginning? No. Snoke was your bad guy. 100%. And after Rian Johnson had him killed off, it put J.J. Abrams and everybody else into a corner. He's not going to create a different villain because we're not emotionally attached to it, and we'd all just be recycling the same stuff that we had in the prequel trilogy. So what does he do? He falls back on what we know. Palpatine. To JJ's credit, they do make a decent enough attempt to make him come off as that he was the one pulling the strings the entire time.
I have been every voice
You have ever heard.
inside your head.
I mean, it illustrates to the audience, like, wait, what? And even Ben Solo is going, that was you? But really, to not have Palpatine's influence still be felt in some capacity, there would have been some kind of disconnectedness to the entire thing. The entire saga, I mean. I do like the idea of Palpatine still being the chess grandmaster of all the events that have happened throughout all 9 films, because it all goes back to him. If it had been anybody else that had risen up after his death, to go into the Chosen One prophecy thing, people were going to complain about the Chosen One prophecy being ruined regardless of whoever popped up. Let's not forget, in the original expanded universe, Palpatine did return, and the way he was killed in that one, casually shot by Han Solo. If that had happened in this movie, fans would have been fuming. Think back to Revenge of the Sith. When Kylo finds him on Exegol, he says the same thing to him that he said to Anakin in the opera scene.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
And as Anakin pledges himself to Palpatine, the Emperor says, to cheat death is a power one has achieved, but if we work together, I know we can discover the secret. Not to mention, they've already established the cloning stuff with the Clone Army, and even in the Bad Batch series, from what I've been told anyway, I haven't watched that show, they've expanded further on that notion. Even in Season 2 of The Mandalorian, they show a Snoke-like body in a Bacta container. And even in Season 3 of Mandalorian, General Hux' father mentions the word Project Necromancer, which officially defines as calling up the spirits of the dead. All that knowledge in mind tells me, anyway, that he probably was planning something like this all along. Jack Bauer says in Season 5 of 24, the first rule of engagement is that you have a contingency plan. So to think about it, I'm not exactly surprised that Palpatine was still able to find a way to still be around in some shape or form. The problem, though, is that it was in desperate need of context. I realize that you don't want to bore the audience with a giant info dump, otherwise you'd be running along the lines of what we get at the end of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960. But all we needed was a short montage or one line or some kind of scene to provide some context as to how exactly he's still here. When the last time we saw him was when Darth Vader threw him down the reactor chute and we saw this giant explosion of lightning. I mean, even Kylo Ren, when he finds him on Exegol and he sees him with his own eyes, he doesn't even ask, No, it can't be.
How are you still breathing?
Good at surviving, or you're bad at killing.
Case in point, Lord of the Rings and the Two Towers, when Gandalf returns as Gandalf the White, and for the next couple minutes, we get a montage and an explanation from Gandalf as to how he survived, and then it moves on and doesn't burden us with it for the rest of the movie. Something like that could have really helped The Rise of Skywalker, even if a lot of people don't like the idea of Palpatine coming back, that it's too lazy, creatively. I think it would have at least somewhat softened the blow on how people felt about his return. And as far as the Chosen One prophecy, Palpatine's return has been stated or claimed by many fans that this somehow ruins Darth Vader's sacrifice and return to the Jedi. Even now, 5 years later, I've never bought into that. Because the thing to remember about Vader's sacrifice on the Death Star, he saved his son's life. His son, who got through to him and made him realize that he was still a good person, therefore guaranteeing further the victory that the rebellion would have against the Empire. And if he hadn't saved Luke, he never would have been able to train Leia, never would have been able to train his nephew Ben, and he never would have had some kind of wisdom to pass on to Rey. And Ben Solo would have never been able to come back and help Rey defeat the Emperor once and for all. It all goes back to Anakin. To say that his legacy defeated Palpatine for good, I mean, if you start to get into the logistics of all this, it gets really messy. But George Lucas has said that Anakin is still the chosen one, and Kathleen Kennedy, with all of the problems that she's had managing Lucasfilm, she's at least respected what George Lucas wants in that category. And while I don't love or hate the Chosen One prophecy, it doesn't add any type of depth to the overall saga. It's just thrown in there to remind us that Anakin is important for some reason. And it renders the original intention of that scene in Return of the Jedi kind of pointless, to be honest with you. That somehow he was predestined to kill the Emperor all along, when it was really just about saving his son. I mean, if I were George Lucas, I would have used the prequel trilogy as a way to enhance that scene in Return of the Jedi with Anakin going, "I lost my wife, but I will not lose my son," saving the one he loves the most. Also, the fact that the Chosen One prophecy was put in place anyway, that means that any story that takes place after the original trilogy was going to have to face that kind of scrutiny, because any Sith that pops up afterward, people were going to claim that the Chosen One prophecy was ruined. And anytime somebody mentions that, it literally makes me want to blow my stack on the person who makes that claim. Your anger should not be towards Rian Johnson, Kathleen Kennedy, or J.J. Abrams on this topic. It should be towards George Lucas, because he's the one who put this thing in the first place, and it doesn't add any type of depth to this saga at all. So Rey heads off to Exegol in Luke's X-Wing, giving the Resistance a needed boost to rally together to go up against the Final Order, giving us a really great speech from Poe and Finn, inspiring all the Resistance to take one final stand against the Empire. And in light of recent events, politically, not to get too deep into the weeds on that topic, but I've been listening to that speech on a regular basis as of late to inspire me to keep going and help anybody who feels marginalized by what's to come in the next few years. Not unheard of to hear a big speech like this in a Star Wars property. I'm a sucker for that kind of inspiring speech regardless. Also, as far as Rose Tico's extremely limited part in The Rise of Skywalker, I feel really bad for Kelly Marie Tran. She did not deserve any of that backlash. Oh god, yeah, I just remembered. General Hux. He turns out to be the spy in the First Order.
I don't care if you win. I need Kylo Ren to lose.
Yeah, that is just dumb. Obviously, this is not the first time that Star Wars has had a dumb character motivation. Still, that's not necessary. I mean, who wrote this anyway? J.J. Abrams, alright. Chris Terrio, what did he do? Oh. Well, no wonder this movie feels messy. To be real, though, I'd rather watch this over Batman v Superman. So Rey arrives on Exegol to confront Palpatine, who offers her a chance to be the Empress of the galaxy. Then Ben Solo shows up, and I love how she figures out that he's still there because of their Force connection, which turns out to be a dyad. Yet another thing that fans do not like in regards to a new addition to the Force. Not exactly a great explanation, but I do like the idea of a Force dyad anyway. And I love the fake out that they use when Rey starts to act like she's going to strike Palpatine down, but then
Made you look.
that pose. Not only his father's son, but his grandfather's grandson. His Jedi fighting skills echo Anakin and then some. And also another thing to note about Palpatine, he's not necessarily back. He's on the verge of coming back. I mean, it's mostly his cronies in the First Order organizing all of the logistics of his final plan. But when he does show up, it's only for about maybe 5 minutes or something? I mean, in the first part of the saga, he spent 30 so years ruling the Republic and then the Empire. And then for the next 30 years afterward, he spends all that time rebuilding what he had planned all along. And then he shows up for only 5 minutes. Not exactly enough time to make an impression. I mean, he does, but not in the ways that he wanted to anyway. As I once fell, so will the last Skywalker.
Do it! He said it! He said it!
But just when it looks like all hope is lost, Rey gets some much needed words of encouragement from the voices of the Jedi that she's been trying to connect throughout the entire film. Hearing the voices of Anakin, Obi-Wan, Luke, Yoda, Mace Windu, Qui-Gon Jinn, Ahsoka Tano, and Luminara, or whatever her name is exactly. Now, originally this was, I think, supposed to be a situation where we saw flashes of Force ghosts right behind her as she faces off against Palpatine. But if I'm understanding the decision why they went this way, they were probably fearing that the fans were going to say that's too fan servicey, you can't do that. So they resorted to this, and yet fans still complained about it anyway. Oh yeah, and we get to hear Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker.
Rey. Bring back the balance, Rey, as I did.
It doesn't render his sacrifice useless, people. I challenge anyone who's watching this to tell me where in this film do they state that Rey is the chosen one. I would love to hear it. And to rewind the clock real quick, I've heard some people say that they would have rather had Anakin's Force Ghost talk to Kylo on the edge of the Death Star wreckage. While I would like to have seen that, but he wouldn't be telling Ben Solo anything that he didn't already know. When he finds Palpatine on Exegol, he tells him, become what your grandfather couldn't. So he already knew that Anakin turned back to the light side anyway. And if you remember from The Force Awakens, when Han says, if Luke couldn't reach him, how could I? And Leia says, Luke's a Jedi. You're his father. So it makes perfect sense as to why his father made him turn back to the good side once and for all. But anyway, back to Rey getting inspiration from the Jedi. Just to hear those voices, and the final one being Luke Skywalker saying the Force will be with you. Oh man, yeah, that's enough for me. I mean, I really would have liked to have seen the scene play out a little differently, but I'll take what I can get. And of course, I love the moment when Lando brings in all the ships from across the galaxy to Finn and Poe, that everybody in the galaxy is not afraid to stand up to the final order. Just like in Avengers Endgame when all of the MCU rallies together to fight Thanos and his army, and in Dark Knight Rises when the GCPD rally up against Bane and his army.
And I'm all the Jedi.
Yeah, I can't help but notice it was similar to Tony Stark saying, I am Iron Man, when he makes the snap. Obviously, I think they were filming this a while before Endgame, or maybe they were filming around the same time. I highly doubt that they were talking to each other as the productions were going on. Couldn't help but notice a similarity regardless. Still, to see Rey using Luke's lightsaber and Leia's lightsaber to repel the Force lightning back onto her grandfather, yep. That'll do just fine. I mean, Palpatine's return is definitely not necessary, but it does add some kind of layers to the dynamic between him and his granddaughter. The fact that she's the opposite of what her grandfather is. It does add an extra amount of depth to her character journey and her rejecting her bloodline and embracing what she wanted to have all along, with a family like Luke Skywalker or Leia. It's the family that she wishes she had that she never did. Are we really supposed to think that she should have willingly gone along with Palpatine since she's simply related to him by blood? Sorry, but you'd have to be a moron to say yes to that. Palpatine's defeated, the Final Order's destroyed, Ben Solo comes out of the rubble, and he uses all the life force that he could transfer from his body to her in order to save her life. Not only do I see this as Rey undoing what her grandfather did to Anakin Skywalker, I see this as Ben Solo doing what his grandfather couldn't do, saving the one he loves the most. Anakin couldn't save Padme, but Ben Solo was able to save Rey. I mean, the kiss isn't exactly necessary, and I think they should have expanded on the romantic tension that was there in The Last Jedi. To see them have their final moment together before he passes away, it feels bittersweet on my end. And I felt so terrible seeing Ben Solo pass away. Now, I realized to reintegrate him back into everyday life in the galaxy, that was going to be nearly impossible because of all the things that he did. Rey obviously knows what happened, but the Resistance and the galaxy by and large would have looked at him and said, wait a minute, he was the leader of the First Order. He killed Han Solo, and he was about ready to dominate the entire galaxy willingly. what changed? Would I have liked to have seen Ben Solo continue on in some capacity? Yes. But ultimately, I'm able to accept this decision here. And then the film ends with Rey going back to the planet Tatooine, Luke Skywalker's original homestead, where it all began so many decades ago. And then meeting this old woman who's walking by asking her who she is, but then notices the Force ghosts of Luke and Rey, smiling from afar, telling her that it's okay. You can take our name. And then it ends with the classic binary sunset theme. Doesn't come even close to the original two binary sunset scenes. I'm still a sucker for that kind of ending. And for anyone who has a problem with Rey taking on the Skywalker name, you've clearly missed the point of this whole sequence. The whole point of Rey's character journey, she spends the entire time trying to find some sense of belonging. She's never fit in anywhere, and when she meets Luke Skywalker and his sister Leia, she finds a sense of belonging that she's been looking for. Again, it's not exactly an appealing idea to go back to Palpatine, who's the only blood relative that she's got left in the universe. Luke and Leia are the only ones that gave her a sense of belonging, outside of Poe and Finn and the rest of the Resistance, and maybe to a certain degree Ben Solo. But also, Luke says to Rey that some things are stronger than blood. If you're judging her by her bloodline alone, sorry, but you have missed the point completely. She chose to be a good person, unlike her grandfather, who was just, I would actually say, was born evil. So, that was a lot of ground to cover. Rise of Skywalker, at the end of the day, it's a film that I can watch and have a good time with, but realistically speaking, it's not that great. In fact, there's a lot of moments that are kinda not good, but not to the point where I personally find it to be a deal breaker. If it is for some people, I completely understand. Do I like this better than The Last Jedi? Well, I think I'd rather watch it over The Last Jedi, but as far as where I would rank it, if I were to redo my ranking on the Star Wars films, I would say they're kind of on the same playing field, just for different reasons. I wouldn't put it exactly above Revenge of the Sith or anything. I would say it's slightly below Revenge of the Sith, but I would rather watch this over Attack of the Clones and The Phantom Menace. In fact, I would rather watch this over Rogue One.
That's for blasphemy.
Yeah, okay. I deserve that. It's not exactly high on my list, but not particularly low on my list. If anything, somewhere around the middle. Do I think that this film, along with its two predecessors, will be viewed more favorably in the future? Personally, I think they might be, but I honestly don't know. But it all depends on what they do going forward and how they tie in to the sequel era. The Mandalorian and Grogu movie, which is set to be released in 2026, will be the conclusion of the Mandalorian series, and it's all supposed to tie everything in together into how the First Order rose to power. That could potentially push things in the right direction for sequel fans, since right now they don't really have much to sink their teeth into. And if a solo movie involving Rey turns out to be pretty good, that could also change things in the sequel trilogy's favor too. Only time will tell. We all said the same thing about the prequels once upon a time, that they would never be beloved as they are right now. History does have a way of rhyming with itself and repeating itself. So those are my thoughts on The Rise of Skywalker. Thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie. Civilly, please. I know with Star Wars it tends to get very heated, but let's just try to keep it as calm and level-headed as possible, and I'll see you in the next one.